Hello, and welcome to the Early American Brass Band Podcast. I'm Chris Troiano, joined always by Stephen Canistrisi.
Hi, everybody.
This is episode 29, and today we're interviewing Steve Dillon from Dillon Music in Woodbridge, New Jersey. Steve Dillon is an instrument salesman in both modern and antique brass instruments, as well as a fife historian and a researcher on all things Arthur Pryor.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really say enough good things about Steve and the way they do business over at Dillon Music. You know, there's a free plug for Dillon Music, but I've bought multiple horns there and gotten horns fixed and cleaned there, and they're great. So we really appreciated him taking the time today to talk to us about, his background, some of his research, especially his collecting of 19th century brass instruments and, earlier 18th century kind of fifes. We think you're going to really enjoy this conversation. And as always, if you like what you're hearing on the show, you can support us on Patreon and Teespring. We have some perks there for Patreon and some merch on our Teespring store, as well as some of Chris's arrangements on our Teespring store. And then you can follow us on all social media platforms. And it would be great if you left a review or a rating, if that's possible, wherever you get your podcasts. That really helps boost this show out. So we would appreciate any help there. And I'm just rambling now. I don't know. Is there anything else to say for this intro?
No, it's okay. I like hearing your rambles. It's fine.
I oftentimes I'm talking and I'm trying to think of ahead to like where I'm going to go, and then I just end up filling space with ums and uhs and just keep reiterating myself.
I'm terrible with that too, but it's okay. That's what editing software is for. Exactly.
We're learning. So
exactly. Without further ado, here is episode 30 featuring Steve Dillon. Well, thank you to Steve Dillon so much for coming on to the Early American Brass Band Podcast. We're so thankful to have you on this afternoon. And fun little fact, Steven and I both actually purchased our euphoniums through Steve Dillon's store. So we are where we are today because of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be on, and thank you for your patronage of the store.
Yeah, of course. Of course, yeah. My dad, we lived on Long Island, as you know, and we would always make the trek out to New Jersey to see you guys, and it was always fun visiting the Toys R Us of brass stores.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Nice. So at the top of each interview, we kind of like to do a little bit of like a biography and give a little bit of background of the person that we're talking about. Would you mind talking a little bit about your musical background and kind of what brought you up to where we are today with being able to own Dillon Music?
Sure. I started in the fourth grade on trombone, like most students do. I took up the tuba in junior high school. A side note, in junior high school, the gentleman who sat next to me on trumpet was a gentleman named David Rashbaum. Today, he goes by the name of David Bryant. He is the pianist from Bon Jovi.
No.
So he was a standmate, basically, in junior high school. And the other one who I, in junior high school, was with was a gentleman who was on David Letterman for many years. He goes by the name of Alan Ches. His real name is Alan Chesnovich. He was a mechanical drawing with me in junior high school. He didn't play in the band at that time, trumpet player. But I went to school at Rutgers University. I graduated with a degree in music education and promptly couldn't get a job, so I spent 6 years in banking. From about junior high school on, I always dealt in instruments. I remember my first time doing a trade. I traded an E-flat clarinet and a B-flat Albert system clarinet for a sousaphone. Then I took the sousaphone and traded it for a Helicon and another sousaphone, and that was in junior high school. Wow. So it's just grown from then. In college, I partnered with a gentleman named John Corson. John has just retired from a university in southern Michigan. And John and I started, we were dealing in antique instruments because a gentleman at that time by the name of Bob Hazen had gone out of business. So we started dealing with him. John went off to get his doctorate at Illinois, so we kind of split up. And I just continued on my own and grew the business. When I got married in 88, if you came to our townhouse, every corner either had a sousaphone or a tuba in it. The guest bathroom had saxophones piled. Sunday was packing day. There was peanuts all over the house.
Wow.
And then in 92, I opened up here in Woodbridge. And the reason I'm in Woodbridge is we're 4 hours from DC, 4 hours from Boston, an hour and 15 from Philly, 45 minutes from New York City. We're right on the train line, and there's 3 major airports right in our vicinity, and Newark Airport is 15 minutes away.
Yeah, wow.
So that's how I basically got started. I've always been a student of history and antique instruments, so it's kind of been a perfect fit for me.
So the idea of dealing in trading and selling instruments began with antique instruments, or was kind of mixed between antique vintage horns and modern produced horns?
Well, I started with used horns. And then we got into antique horns when John and I, because that's what Bob Hazen used to do. He used to send out lists. Well, back in the old days, we used to make lists of antique instruments and send them all over the world. And that's what I kind of got started, then branched off from there.
Gotcha.
When I went on my own. Because, when we opened up the store, I started not just used instruments and antique, because that's a very limited market.
Yeah, definitely.
We started with new instruments and now we're full line, brass and woodwind.
Was when you first started with that vintage exchange, kind of when you started building your own collection too, when you kind of saw some cool things come through, you kind of pick them out for yourself? Or?
Well, at one point, you see, I've been a collector all my life, and on various things. So at one point, I was collecting trombones. My personal collection of trombones numbered at 250. And one day I went home and I said, what the hell am I doing? And I got rid of them all, and I started on other things. But, the other collection that is, I do have various things, from the golden age of bands, we'll call it. I owned Arthur Pryor's trombone. I still own it, but it's been donated to the National Music Museum up in South Dakota. I also owned a collection of 500 historic fifes, military fifes. Yeah, they're now also housed up at the museum.
Gotcha.
Because you know what? We're not going to live forever. And at the end of the day, it's better to give it to some place that's going to care for it and let people research it than it is to just hold on to it and try to go to the grave with it. It ain't going to happen.
Yeah, we just had Sabina Klaus on from the museum a few weeks ago for this show, and talking to her and talking to other musicians that are collectors all kind of share similar sentiments. The idea that they're just temporary curators of the collection kind of is the recurring theme that keeps on coming up with that.
That's absolute, 100%.
So what was the bug that got the fife interest going? Was that seems a little bit different than the brass trajectory of the other things?
Well, I did some family research about 10, 15 years ago, and come to find out, my family's very well documented, the Dillons. Matter of fact, I'm the first in 11 generations from father to son born out of the old Commonwealth of Virginia.
Wow.
Meaning encompassing West Virginia. Now, my third great-granduncle was a fifer. He fifed in the Civil War and in the Mexican War. And my sixth great-grandfather was a fifer with the 2nd Virginia Regiment during the Revolution. So I got interested in that. Then I got interested in reenacting for a brief time. And then when I started that, I started to find out that in the fife world, it's very... Believe it or not, until I came along, nobody really even knew what a Revolutionary War fife looked like. They said they did, but then when I did research, I find that in most collections, what they have are 19th century items. So I started a massive collection, little by little. Matter of fact, one of my fifes, one of the first ones I purchased, is made by Thomas Cusack, who was in business from around 1738 to around 1798. An English maker, and it's on display at the New Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. During this time, I collected, my collection numbers, like I mentioned, about 500, but I have about 15 actual instruments from the time of the Revolution. And the museum now has those instruments, and it's the only museum in this country that can document that they have instruments from the time of the Revolution. But then I expanded, of course, to Civil War instruments, and I just became interested in it.
Yeah.
I became an authority on the fife. I tell you what, it doesn't get you a date on Friday night.
How were you able to date those fifes to that time period? I doubt they were stamped in any way, right? Or was it just out of the construction?
Yes, they were stamped. A lot of them. If the only way you can truthfully date an instrument is at least a fife, because it's so basic, and they haven't changed the way really that the design in a couple of 100 years. You have to go by the maker. Now, I have an eye now that I can look at a fife and I can basically give a date range, but you have to look for the maker. Now, the 15 I talk about are actual instruments that are stamped by makers.
Oh, wow. Very cool.
Then it expanded. Like, I was very interested in the Boston makers. You know, our country was making instruments fairly early on, and it's a surprise to a lot. I remember one day I was with Gerhard Meinl of Meinl Wesson, and he said to me, he says, I've got to go to an event in Martinikerken next week. I said, what's the event? He says, well, it's the anniversary of the first brass maker starting to make in Martinikerken. I said, well, what year is that? He says, 1765. I said, really? We had a French horn maker in New York in 1765 named Thomas Dash. Oh. He says, I can't believe that. And a lot of people don't realize we did have a large manufacturing here in the country. The key is they didn't just do that. That French horn maker also was a tinsmith.
There you go.
Because we didn't have a clientele just to be able to support making one thing.
Yeah, definitely. Right. Kind of a niche market at the time, especially.
Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. Very cool. When you were doing the reenacting, did you go in as a fifer, or were you kind of in there as infantry and then you gravitated towards the music side after you were in already?
I went in as a fifer with the, matter of fact, there's a regiment called the 2nd Virginia Regiment. That's what my ancestor served in, and that's what I was the fifer of.
That's very cool.
I was a fifer of the 2nd Virginia. Now, there's a reason that I also did that, because when you're an infantry person, you have to carry a musket, and that means you got to clean the musket. I didn't have to clean anything. I just carried my pipe.
Yeah, there you go. Right. That's like when kids in middle school pick their instruments and they're upset that they picked the tuba and they got to lug that thing around.
yeah, absolutely.
Pick the lightest
Try
instrument.
And fit it on
for
the
sure.
Bus.
Yeah. That's why those things get banged up so much, because they're always just knocking them into the side of the bus and stuff. Right. Man, that's funny. Did you ever venture into the world of Civil War reenacting, or did you stay purely in the 18th century?
I stayed mainly in the 18th century. I was interested more in that at the beginnings. And it's very interesting, the group I was with, the 2nd Virginia, a lot of it was made up of people from Colonial Williamsburg.
Oh, cool.
Very hardcore reenactors and very hardcore historians. I mean, everything that they researched everything to the nth degree, which I was very interested in. That's why I fell in with them and I felt comfortable. They knew, hey, you need anything to know about fights? Call Steve. He'll know everything you ever wanted to know about it.
Yeah, that's for sure. My wife recently came into possession of 2 fifes, and I was asking people about it, and they're like, oh, talk to Steve Dillon. So I had sent you a message of 2 pictures of those, and yeah, you were very helpful. Thank you.
You know, I put out a website, fifemuseum.com, and it's just a labor of love. I mean, I haven't worked on it in quite a while now, but it's in the fife world, it's funny how much misinformation there is out there. And I wanted to dispel a lot of that. And that's what I've done. And again, there's a lot of correlation with the brass world, because, just because you were a woodwind maker, that doesn't mean you didn't interact with brass makers or were a brass maker. I mean, Samuel Graves started out as a woodwind maker. Then he was making brass instruments.
Yeah, very true.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Henry Sibley up in Boston, who made the keyed bugles for Ned Kendall, he was also partners with Walter Crosby, the fife and the woodwind maker. So, there was always they didn't just make one thing a lot of times.
Yeah.
So
sure.
I in researching fifes, I also found out a lot about brass makers.
Yeah, that's convenient. And kind of what we were saying before, diversifying, I'm sure, helps with sales for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, it makes total sense from a business perspective to.
Well, that's the other side of it.
Yeah. Right. You talked a little bit how you kind of got involved in collecting brass instruments from early on, your early days in middle school. But I was wondering, maybe we can start with, since you own Dillon Music and have a great repair shop there too, do you have, maybe this can be a way to get into your personal collection, but do you have a favorite or a highlight, of an instrument that either came to you somehow or came through the shop for repair?
My most prized instrument was Arthur Pryor's trombone. Mm-hmm. And how that came to me was I ought to give you a little background on how I really got interested in the history of American bands. When I was in high school, probably a sophomore, I went to the library and there was a book. It was called Bands of America by Schwartz. Mm-hmm. And it's no longer in publication. If you can find it on eBay, you usually can get it for very reasonably. It's a great book to pick up. Schwartz was, I think he was an amateur historian, but the nice thing about Schwartz was he worked for the Conn Corporation. Mm-hmm. And he got to interview a lot of people who had, been around at that time. The book was written in, I believe, the 50s. But he knew people. He knew Arthur Pryor. He knew John Philip Sousa. He knew all these guys. So he got a lot of his stuff, even though it's not footnoted, is very, very accurate. He talks about Jules Levy. He talks about Ned Kendall. He talks about all that stuff. Yeah. And that's what really sparked my interest. And then I started to research at that time who these people were. Herbert L. Clark. I remember the Trumpet Guild had just come out with the record, and I bought it and I brought it home and listened to it and was mesmerized. Clark playing, Carnival of Venice and stuff. And then they came out later on with the Arthur Pryor one that was done by a good friend of mine at that time, Fred Williams. He was a record collector in Philadelphia. So I got really interested in these guys, and I got really interested in Arthur Pryor. And, Pryor lived in Asbury Park, New Jersey, and his band played there for many years. And that really started to push me. Now, again, I started researching Pryor quite early on, probably in my early college years, started researching, doing interviews with band members. I'd go to Rutgers Library at the time and look through the Asbury Park Press and pull out stuff. And I interviewed his granddaughter. So I was really interested in it. And then one day I got a letter in the mail. And see, everybody knew, just like with fifes. Hey, I want to talk about Pryor. Call Steve. So I get a letter in the mail, and a guy writes me a letter. He says, listen, I have this trombone. And everybody said I should call you. It's engraved on the bell, made for Arthur Pryor by Jake Burkle, 1894. Yeah. Of course, my hand started shaking.
Yeah.
I got on the phone, and that was about 28, 29 years ago, and I purchased the instrument off the gentleman. And it had been the instrument at that time that I had been looking for. I wondered what had happened to Pryor's trombone. Of course, he had many of them, I would think, over his career. But there's an article in the Asbury Park Press from the late 30s, and it says, Mr. Pryor's prized trombone sits on his mantle, engraved, made for Arthur Pryor by Jake Burkle, 1894. So for whatever reason, he kept this instrument, and I have numerous pictures of him with it over his years. I even have a picture of him and Jake Burkle in their latter years standing there with the horn, and Burkle's actually pointing to it.
Yikes.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Did those pictures come with the horn when you bought
No.
it, or did you find them after the fact?
Find them after the fact. So it came, his horn and his mouthpiece. Now, Pryor, you got to realize, Pryor changed the way the trombone was written for and played when he went on the scene worldwide. Oh, yeah. When he went to Europe, the trombonists in Europe were really pissed off at him. They said, you know what? Now they're going to think we can play like you. And they're going to start writing. And they did. The composers would say, well, why can't you play like him?
Basically a euphonium part now, right?
Yeah. So, and it really pushed the trombone forward. He was a very interesting person. So that's what started all that. And that was probably the instrument that I was the most, that was the instrument that is dearest to me.
Are any of those pictures of him playing it in concert, or is it possible that horn was maybe just a display horn on the mantle for him?
No. The instrument, he used it so much he wore through the slide.
Nope, there you go.
And they replaced it for him in 1934. Now, there are pictures of him with different horns over the years, but a couple of the pictures, and the funny thing about Pryor is there's very, very few pictures of him playing, actually playing. And it's funny because in his day, he was, and he probably still is today, the most recorded trombonist, basically solo trombonist in history. He has over 225 solo recordings.
Yeah, well.
A lot of them are not, most of them are not his technical solos. Most of them are popular songs of the day. And, a recording like his "Oh Dry Those Tears" sold in excess of almost a 250,000 copies back in the 1920s.
Wow.
But there's very few pictures of him playing, but I have pictures of him holding the horn at different times in his career.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Very cool. Do you know the history of that horn after Pryor was done? Well, that's a nice way of saying it. After Pryor died, do you know the path of that horn?
The instrument went to his son, Roger, who was a movie star. A lot of people don't realize Roger Pryor they used to call him the poor man's Cary Grant, the poor man's Cary Grant. It went to his son, and then his son, somehow it got sent up to this fella in Indiana. No. So that's the only thing I know. But it went to his son after that. I even have it in the will that the son, because he was a trombone player, Roger, and it went to him. Arthur had two sons, Arthur Jr. and Roger.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's awesome that you were able to stitch together the provenance of that instrument and get all the documentation. It's pretty indisputable at this point what you have.
Well,
which
the
is
engraving
awesome.
On it alone, made for Arthur Pryor. Although I've seen one trombone over the years that somebody faked it on it. I was at a brass conference and this other dealer said, well, we have one of Pryor's trombones. I said, really? Let me take a look at it. And it was engraved in such a way. And I said, wait a minute. It said, as made for Arthur Pryor. Well, they spelled made, M-A-I-D.
All right.
I said, well, that's not how you spell made. I've never seen the horn again. It disappeared.
Oh, yeah. That's funny. Man. That's
but
cool.
I have had, over the years, I've sold many collections. Back about 20 some odd years ago, I sold the Benkovic collection. Fred Benkovic had collected and had in his possession at that time one of the largest collection of 19th century American brass instruments held in private hands. Mm-hmm. And he got a hold of me, and when he was finally saying, listen, I'm done collecting, I want to get rid of it, I want you to sell my collection. Some of the pieces were just phenomenal. A lot went into the Utley collection that the museum owns. Mm-hmm. The one there that was probably the most amazing instrument was the high B-flat keyed bugle made of tortoise shell. And you could take it and hold it up to the light, and the sun would shine through it. It was gorgeous. It was made by a Connecticut maker. The only other one that exists is in the Smithsonian that's in pieces.
Yeah, yikes. Was that a novelty, or like?
No, he was trying to make instruments out of tortoise shells.
Wow, that's very strange. Did you hear it? Was it playable?
Oh yeah, it was playable. Yeah, I don't remember what it played. I think Steve Sharpey played it. Okay. I'm not sure. Joe allowed people to play a lot of his instruments, and he was a great guy. I'm talking about collectors. Joe Utley was one of the top in the world that I knew.
Yeah, that's awesome. When you were facilitating that transition of that previous collection you were talking about before it went to Utley, did it go as a full collection basically to the Utley collection, or was it kind of pieces?
No, Joe brought, at that time, he bought about 7 or 8. The collection was quite large, but Fred Benkovic used to, what he did, he was very big into over the shoulders and Civil War stuff, a lot of it. And so he would have multiples. And the one thing Joe Utley, the odder it was, the better Joe liked it. If it was very odd, he wanted it for his collection. So there was only certain things that were very, that fit into Joe's collection. The rest of it went to people all over the country. Alex Pollock bought some of it. He's a collector in Michigan. I don't remember exactly. Like I said, it's so many years ago, but the collection was, most of the rest was dispersed.
A lot of times when people are asking about brass band instrumentations and are asking just the general questions of the highest instruments and the lowest instruments, we say that in the 19th century, it traditionally went down to low E flat bass, but then obviously with modern tubas, we know that there's the double B flat bass, and people were saying that that's the lowest it goes. But we know through some well-documented social media posts that Dillon Music did, you guys recently had a much lower tuba come through the shop recently. Can you talk a little bit about that project overall?
Yeah, the Harvard tuba, as we call it. The Harvard tuba, I got contacted by Carl Fisher Music in New York, and they wanted me to come up and wanted us both, Matthew and I, to come up and look at their big tuba that they have there. We dubbed it Big Carl. All right. And what they have is a monster instrument. But the valves are fake. It's basically a bugle. The valves are fake on the one at Carl Fisher. Well, by us going up there and doing some work on that and helping them with that, I was contacted by Harvard University about their instrument, which we knew about for many years. So we went up and looked at it a couple of times. The instrument was made by Bess & Company, and not much was known about it at that time. I mean, we looked at it, had sustained tremendous amount of damage. We talked to them about it, and they put it out for bid, and they finally came back to us and they said, we want you to do the work. And the funny thing was this. They said, they originally called us and they said, we want you to do the work. And I said, okay. They said, but we have a stipulation. I said, yes, what is it? We don't want the patina touched. I said, well, we can't do the work.
Yeah.
I said, you got to understand, in order for us to restore this, we have to take it apart. In order to resolder parts, we have to polish them. In order to polish them, you're going to take off some of the patina. If you want me not to touch it, I says, if we do it like that, the entire instrument's going to look like some big leopard. And I don't want that associated with my name. They said, well, then it's off. So I was up at the museum. I'm on the board of trustees of the museum, National Music Museum. I'm up there for a board meeting. And one of the other board members, Marlo Siegel, comes over to me and he says, now Marlo is an alumni of Harvard. And he was very involved, and he's passed since, involved in the Harvard bands, alumni bands. So he comes over to me, he says, well, when are you going to get to work on that tuba? Now, a backstory, I knew he was the one behind Don't Touch the Patina.
Okay.
And I said to him, well, Marlo, we can't do it. And I explained why. And he just smiled, and there was nothing else. Next thing I knew, I get a phone call, come get the tuba. Now, we were not the lowest bid. We were not the highest bid, but they said, we knew you would take care of it. Now, a backstory on the instrument. The Harvard tuba was made for the 1889 Paris Exposition. And now you can find out a lot about this on Dave Ditweiler's page. I don't know if you know Dave. They call him the tuba pastor. He's a minister. But he also has a passion for tubas. Done some very, very good research. And what we found out is the Harvard tuba was made for the 1889 Paris Exposition. It was made, it did not sit in the instrument hall. They had a special building for it. after the exposition, Carl Fisher purchased it. He brought it over here. It stood in Carl Fisher's window until 1912 when they had Big Carl made. Big Carl was made by Bolin and Fuchs, where that one was made by Besson. Then it went up to Boston and sat in the Carl Fisher store in Boston in the window. And Harvard used to rent it for football games. So one year they went to rent it. This was in the 40s. They went in. They went out. They took the tuba to the football game. They came, and then on Monday morning they looked at the receipt and they said, "Hey, wait a minute! This isn't a rental receipt. This is a sales receipt." Went back to Fisher and said, "Hey, this is a sales receipt." They said, "Keep it."
Nope.
So it stayed at Harvard. Wow. Until we got it and we brought it down, and we did a tremendous amount. You can find some videos and stuff on the internet of some stuff we've done. It was a large project. It took most of my shop to do, but we were very pleased on how it came out. It does play.
Yeah.
It's not a joy to play. Matter of fact, Mike Roylance from the Boston Symphony actually played it at a Harvard University band's anniversary just last year, I believe. You can probably find that online too. Sam Palafian, the late great tubist, he also played it. You can probably find some stuff on that too. It is not, we made a special mouthpiece adapter for it and everything. It's not a joy to play.
Yeah. I think once you guys finished the restoration, I think you posted a video of Derek Fenstermacher playing it also.
Yeah, Derek got some good notes out of it. It was a novelty. They did not make it to be used, but it was used. I mean, there is one poster. Matter of fact, there's a poster of the Gilmore Band.
Oh, yeah.
And you see the big Besson up top.
Yeah.
Now, whether Gilmore used it, there's evidence that he might have tried to, but never actually used it. We don't know.
Yeah, like he liked the look of it in that picture.
Well, Gilmore was always a bigger, better, more,
Yeah.
And there's a possibility, but they probably found out it's great for a few notes, and that's about it.
Yeah, that's kind of like in the first Fantasia movie when they're showing all the silhouettes of all the instruments and they show a sousaphone, but they didn't use a sousaphone in that recording. They just used it for the silhouette looked nice. So.
Right.
No.
Yeah. So I guess we didn't actually specify. So I guess that Harvard tuba is actually an octave below double B flat, right? That's
it's a triple B flat.
Yeah.
The
Big Carl, that was a B
triple
flat.
B flat.
Bugle,
same thing.
I guess we could call, B flat.
Yeah, it is a triple B flat. The interesting thing, Dave Dittweiler found, and see, there was, again, I go back to that Bands of America book. Schwartz talks about two giant tubas being made in the 19th century, one for Brooks' band and the other for Innes's band. Come to find out that they were not that giant of an instrument like these. We always thought that these were part of that tubas made because he doesn't say Conn made them. What happened was when this one was made by Besson in 1889. In 1912, Carl Fisher took delivery of two giant tubas. The one, Big Carl, which you can find online videos of. The New York Times you just have to Google New York Times giant tuba, and there'll be a small piece on Big Carl. Matter of fact, Derek Finchmacher is playing it. Carl Fisher ordered from Bolin and Fuchs two giant tubas, one that went to their New York store, Big Carl, and one that went to their Chicago store. Now, Dave Dittweiler found out that the Chicago store of Carl Fisher was purchased, the band instrument department was purchased by Conn in the late 30s. And he found a newspaper article about Big Carl's brother being destroyed for the scrap drives of World War II. There's a fellow from the Conn factory. They have the other big tuba there. They painted a picture of Hitler's face on it, and he takes a sledgehammer and destroys it, and they put it in the melting pot.
Yeah, so that's interesting because I know we've had other interviews where we've mentioned that happening, brass instruments becoming shell casings kind of thing. And I think in the past we've said that we've heard the story, but haven't seen actual documentation of it happening. So
it has happened.
There it is.
Conn had an advertisement showing a tuba and how many shells and everything it would make to bomb the Germans.
Wow. There you go.
But they destroyed this. You can find pictures of it on Dave Ditweiler's site. They destroyed this instrument to help with the war effort. And originally we looked at it and I said, no, that's we thought it might have been a Conn. No, it was a Carl Fischer. And how did it get to the Conn factory? How it got to the Conn factory is because they bought the band instrument store of Carl Fischer, and they probably pulled it down there and just put it up in the rafters. We have here at the shop, I have in the display cases, a couple very rare instruments, extremely rare, one of a kind, some of them. Outside of the Ford Museum in Michigan, I am the only place that has 2 box valve instruments made by the Quinby brothers up in Boston. I've got a box valve cornet and a box valve trombone. Box valve is a valve that actually goes like the valves are in like a box and it slides.
Mm-hmm.
And the other instruments that I have 2 instruments that were made for the Gilmore band. They're called Orpheans. I've got one made in E flat and one made in B flat. And basically they wanged around and come under. I can send you pictures of them if you want.
Yeah.
They're very rare too. Other rare instruments. I also have a double belled. Well, you guys are euphoniumists.
Yeah.
I've got a 2-bell. Matter of fact, on my Facebook, it's in my profile picture. I have this 2-bell thing, we'll call it. It's basically the small bell of a double bell euphonium done twice. All right, so it's a 4-valve instrument, but the 4th valve being the changeover bell. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why they were made? The double bell euphonium, you got the sound of the big bell, and then you switch to what they used to call the trombone bell.
Mm-hmm.
All right, gives you total different sound quality. This is both the same. Now, I got this, a young person come in and one Christmas time, and I normally don't work at Christmas, but I came in to do something, walked through the door, and I see this young lady playing this thing. What the hell is this? What? Oh my God. So I got the story from them. They picked it up at a yard sale in New York area.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's gold plated. And it's just engraved C.G. Conn, nothing on it, but C.G. Conn. And it mystified me. But over my years, I've talked to a lot of people. And I've interviewed a lot of people or, been friends with a lot of people. And a memory came back to me of Alan Ostrander. Alan Ostrander was the bass trombonist of the New York Philharmonic back in the 40s. He was in that famous Gordon Pulis, Bill Bell, section, Van Haney section.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I used to call him up and bug him when I was a young kid and ask him questions. And see, Ostrander had studied with both Gardell Simons from the who was principal trombone, the Sousa Band, and principal trombone of the Philadelphia Orchestra. He studied with him, and he studied with Simone Mantia. Matter of fact, he credited Simone Mantia with helping him get his career going.
Nice.
And as a side note, I once asked him a question. I said, listen, you studied with both, and you got to realize this was probably in the late 70s, early 80s. So he knew all the new players and everything. I said, listen, you studied with both Gardell Simons and Simone Mantia. Could you tell me a little bit about their playing? And he said, well, Mr. Simons was content to play long tones all day. Now, a little known fact is Remington, the Remington studies,
Mm-hmm.
Remington was a student of Simons. That's where he got a lot of his stuff, from Gardell Simons.
There you go.
I said, well, what about Mantia? He goes, well, Mr. Mantia. And he always called them Mr. Simons and Mr. Mantia.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I said, what was his playing like? He said, to this day, when I think of his playing, my hair stands on end.
Wow.
He said, I never heard anybody before or since been able to play things on the trombone like he could. Mm. And I asked him, I said, well, take somebody of today. And he thought, he says, you know the technique of a Bill Watrous? I says, yes. He says, take that farther. Now give him great power. He said, Mr. Mantia had a big, full tone.
Yeah.
I said, well, did you ever hear Arthur Pryor? He said, no. He said, I never heard Arthur Pryor play in person. He says, but everybody in those days said Mantia was second only to Pryor. And he says, I knew what Mantia was. He says, I dare to think what Pryor was.
Yeah, well.
Now, getting back to that double belt thing. When talking to Ostrander, I asked him questions. He says, well, when Mr. Mantia died, he says, I went down to his house to buy some instruments for some of my students. He says, Mrs. Mantia was selling them. And I said, well, what was his double bell and all? He says, well, there was a couple things there. He says, I bought basically a couple of trombones. Believe it or not, one of his trombones that he bought went to one of the Biddlecombe brothers. And then I got it many years later. And then it went to one day I put it up for sale. I said, I can't keep everything. Put it up for sale. It was a gold-plated Conn that was made for Mantia in the 40s. Mm-hmm. And I got a phone call. On a Saturday, one of my salesmen calls me and is frantic. There's a guy, crazy. He needs to talk to you. His name is Joe Mantia. He's Simone Mantia's great grandnephew.
Oh, wow.
He's a trombone player, bought the instrument. So I was happy to see it go home. Yeah. But Ostrander said he bought a couple of trombones, and he said, then there was this thing. He said that had two bells. I said, oh, you mean the double bell euphonium? He goes, no. It wound around and attached just two small bells. And I said, well, what was it? He goes, I don't know. He said, but Mrs. Mantia said Simone would take it and he'd practice on it and walk up and down the stairs of the house while playing on it. And I'm not saying it's 100%, but I suspect that this instrument that I have here was owned by Mantia. And the reason I say that is Mantia wasn't a big believer in all kinds of engraving on his horns. He hated it. Mm-hmm. I knew one of the guys who had one of his double bells, and he said the double bell was very plain. No naked ladies, no and all this. It's a very plain instrument, CG Conn, and that's what this is. And gold-plated, just like Mantia's horns would have been. Mm-hmm. So it's a possibility this was made from Simone Mantia.
So it's like a double bell trombone kind of thing, valve trombone.
It's like the small bell. Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And I couldn't understand why you would have two bells of the same sound, but you can put a mute in one. You can actually turn the bells to face anyway.
Yeah,
but I don't know. But I suspect that it was made for Mantia to be a practice instrument.
Yeah, interesting. How did it sound? Or how does it sound when you play it?
It sounds like a small bell of a double bell euphonium.
Yeah. Interesting. That's strange. We'll be sure
Just
to...
the least appealing bell of a double bell euphonium.
We'll be sure to include a picture of that, if you don't mind, in our show notes of this episode. I think that'd be cool for people to see, for sure.
Yeah, I have your Facebook profile picture pulled up. I wonder, you said you can turn the bells in any direction. I wonder if it was like a marching band thing. You turn one bell to one side of the street, the other bell to the other side.
I don't know. And like I said, Mantia was known to... I interviewed a guy who had studied with... I interviewed a couple guys who studied with Mantia. But one of them was Frank Bryan, who was very good friends with Mantia. Frank Bryan basically ran the Asbury Park Municipal Band after Pryor died until, I don't know, almost the 90s. He was very good friends with Mantia, and he said Mantia would practice most of the day. He says, I would hear him on Wanamassa Lake. He owned a house down in Wanamassa Lake. In the mornings in the summer, Mantia would open his windows, start his practice, and you could hear him going up and down the stairs, walking up and down the stairs. He said he'd break for his dinner, and then he'd go play his night concert.
Yikes.
He was an amazing player.
Yeah, that's incredible. That reminds me of like when my dad would tell a story of times that he played in an orchestra that accompanied Doc Severinsen. He said that they would be, on the stage doing their warm-ups, and they would hear Doc like either backstage or underground practicing, and then he'd come out, do sound check with the orchestra, go back down, keep practicing, then play the concert, go down, keep practicing. Like he was like playing nonstop.
Well, they know. See, that's one thing Frank Bryan said to me. I says, why did he practice so much? He goes, well, Mr. Mantia knew as he got older, in order to keep up with the younger generation, he had to practice more than he did when he was younger.
Mm-hmm.
And it made sense if he had Conn make him up this thing. It's much heavier carrying the double belled euphonium. And the trombone, you can't walk up and down stairs with the slide. So it's quite possible he had an early practice euphonium that he could go up and down and play.
Yeah. That's incredible. That's a good story. I like that one.
Yeah.
So kind of tying into this theme of our discussion of vintage brass instruments and stuff, let's kind of tie it into maybe modern reproductions can maybe be a part of this also. Do you see any way forward or any need for either education or performing vintage brass instruments to kind of be accessible to either students or performers?
I do, because I always say, a lot of times people don't understand what those who came before had to do or had to, go through with certain things with, and especially with instruments. I mean, cornets or trombone, especially with, let's say, trombones.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you a good example. I did a project with Joe Alessi, principal trombone of the New York Philharmonic. I don't think I had to say that, but I said it.
Who? Yeah.
We did basically honoring Pryor, and it's a CD called Slide Partners. All right. And one of the things we did was we actually did a reverse Natalie Cole. Natalie Cole took her father and brought her up into the 20th century and did a duet with him. You know that name? We took Joe and we threw him back 100 years ago on Pryor's trombone.
Nice. And
had him do a duet. We actually got a guy in Long Island named Peter Dilge, his name was. He had an Edison studio machine that was actually in the Edison studios. And we went to his house, and Joe, you can find some of those pictures on my Facebook too. Joe went to his house, had the recording of Pryor in his ear, and then he played the duet part. We had a guy from the Army band, James Kasich, do the duet part for us, write it. And Joe got to find out what it was to play on an instrument. Now, Pryor slide, even though it was redone in the 30s, is still not a great slide.
Mm-hmm.
And Joe became very appreciated of, first off, when he had to deal with the recording, how what it did to your sound.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's still out there. I think the beginning one is out there where Joe is doing a test of a cylinder. And when I do some lectures on Arthur Pryor, I talk about his sound quality, and I actually show the other side of this cylinder test we did with Joe. He's playing Deary. Big, beautiful sound as he normally has. He's on Pryor's trombone, but big, beautiful sound. Then the recording comes back, then we played the cylinder back, and he got,
Wow.
And he actually says, "That's me."
Huh.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. Was when we listen back to recordings, like listen to old recordings of Mantia or something, and we think that it might sound fartsy and super old kind of thing. It's not necessarily the tone quality of the day that they were going for. It's just affected by the recording technology.
Well, that's absolute. That's absolute. And if you get the slide partners, we did 2 Deary and Oh Dry Those Tears, where you don't know by splicing them in, you don't know if Pryor's playing the although you know because of his very fast vibrato, you don't know who's playing what. It sounds like they recorded it both 100 years ago. Yeah, well, because that's what it did to Joe's sound. But the same thing with the slide. Joe goes, "Oh, how did Pryor do it?" I said, "Well, when you're brought up on something and you don't know anything more, you make it work."
Yeah, that's true.
So all of those guys thought differently back then. Give an example with Pryor. I said, "Listen, how did he do it? We think vertical, B flat, F, B flat, D, F, B flat." Pryor thought horizontal. He said, "I'll get any note in any position I want to get it." Now, he understood that you wouldn't lay on a note in a false position, but he knew that he didn't have to go down to 7. He can lip it down, especially in a passing thing. They actually hearkened back to the earlier hand horn style where they would bend things.
Yeah.
And that's why, getting back to your question, that's why it's interesting for people to be able to play instruments and understand, hey, this is the what they were up against. I have new respect for them because, at the end of the day, we stand on the shoulders of those who came before.
Yeah.
And if you understand what they were up against, Pryor was playing on a slide. He was playing on a brass slide with 2 nickel stockings that you put oil on. How did he play so quickly?
Yeah. What's the deterioration like? Like, Steven and I are more familiar with valved brass instruments from the 19th century and stuff, and we're kind of familiar with how those can be maintained. But from the same time period and earlier for trombones, what's the deterioration like? And is it possible that hand slide on Pryor's felt a lot nicer a while ago? Or
no, especially his original slides. Matter of fact, there's stories about when he first picked up the slide trombone, he thought there was only 3 positions. And you say, how could you be so ignorant to think that? He came out of a cornet. 3 valves on the cornet must be 3 positions. And he practiced for 6 months until somebody said, there are 7 positions and you're supposed to put oil on the slide.
Oh, well.
It reminds me of the story that Mark Jenkins told us, Chris. I don't know if you were there as a studio class or whatnot, but someone took a lesson with either Simone Mantia or Art Lehman, and they didn't know how to oil their valves. And,
that was Mantia.
That was Mantia.
Mantia actually didn't know how to oil, and Lehman told me that directly.
Yeah.
He said, I was in a lesson. He used to go up to New York, and Mantia had an apartment there. And he would take lessons. It was interesting. Art Lehman, but Art actually gave, it's interesting you say that, because it goes back to what I was just saying about horizontal. One of my ex-employees went down and took lessons off Art Lehman. And Art said, he said, turn around. He says, I'm going to play a B-flat scale. I want to know the fingerings. So he plays a B-flat scale. He goes, all right, turn around. What's the fingerings? He goes, well, da, 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 da. No, da, 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 without moving the things. He says, you can do it. I've seen Stephen Mead do it.
Wow.
And, but Lehman told me he went up to take a couple lessons off Mantia, and Mantia was having trouble with his valve. And he said, Mr. Lehman, could you help me? My valve isn't working. So he says, I unscrewed it. I took it out, wiped it off, put some oil on it. I said, here. He goes, thank you so much. Mantia actually had a repairman that he would just take his horn to. He didn't know. He knew how to play. He didn't know anything else.
Yeah.
Interesting. But you feel like that would that they would go hand in hand. Like, I feel like I know my instrument well because of the time I've spent with it, and and knowing how it functions helps inform how to play it also. So that's interesting that he was able to master it by having that minimal amount of knowledge for the mechanics.
And he never used it. It's bizarre. I know it's bizarre. It was very interesting. Mantia was a very interesting man. Very very underrated, but he very, very great musician. And but I know Lehman said he was an absolutely horrible teacher. He said he didn't know how he did things. He says, I remember I was practicing on this. I was practicing one of his solos, and it comes. There's one run in it or a cadenza that's a little long, and he says I didn't have enough breath. And he says Mantia was an old man, and you know how sometimes when they get older, the clothes kind of hang off them. Mm. He said, so here he is with this big baggy suit on, and he says, well, I don't have a problem with it. And he took a breath in, and his clothes actually got, his chest expansions, he said, was so great, the clothes got tight. Oh. And he was able to, but he couldn't tell you how to do that. He also said, I remember asking him, Mr. Mantia, I don't know how to get this high note. And Mantia just said, I don't know, blow down in the mouthpiece. I don't know.
Yeah, wow.
A lot of people don't realize, too, a lot of people, jazz artists went and studied, and classical went and studied with Mantia. I had a customer once tell me he had studied with Mantia. He says, I got out of my lesson, and Tommy Dorsey is waiting to go in for his lesson.
There you go. Man, that's awesome.
That's funny.
But when you've been playing vintage brass instruments yourself and stuff, have you ever had success with playing on modern mouthpieces, or have you always attached period mouthpieces to horns?
Most of the time, a period mouthpiece needs to be used, and the reason is the modern mouthpieces, a lot of them, not all of them, tend to be not a good fit. I used to send to Saxton's cornet band down in Kentucky. This was years ago. They used to call me when they'd get a new instrument. They say, hey, we got a new cornet. Can you send down a bunch of old mouthpieces? Because you know what happened? Back in the day, especially with the smaller makers like Graves and E.G. Wright and all them, they made mouthpieces to fit their horns.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the correct fit, the intonation just is totally out there. Plus, you need that, especially with the older brass instruments, it has to be that B cup. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Most of them are using that B cup, and it makes a big difference. And it really does, because, you know, they're totally different instruments. You think they're the same, but they're not. You know, a lot of people don't realize this. You know, if you think about marching bands today, it's a totally different thing. You go back 100 years ago, or a little bit more than 100 years ago, you read some of Herbert Clark's, not How I Became a Cornetist. He has a second book called The Road to Success. And musicians in those days made livings. You know, a gig was a marching gig. You know, you got paid a regular wage, like a theater gig. So it was a viable thing at that time. Nowadays, they look down upon it. The other thing is, with marching bands, they always thought the Sousa Band was a marching band. The Sousa Band, in its from 1892 to 1932, when Sousa died, only marched 7 times.
Yeah.
So they were not a marching band; they were a concert band.
Something that I thought was interesting, you know, if we're just going to talk about marching for a second, that in one of the books that I was reading, an interesting connection that they made was that how in the 19th century you have, you know, the American brass band tradition kind of developing parallel, but separately from the British brass band tradition, but how the brass band tradition, as we know, was reliant heavily on competition, or is now, you know, reliant heavily on competition and doing the competitive aspect of brass banding, and how you could claim that the American version of that is either, you know, competitive high school marching band or drum corps international, kind of having that with DCI being an all brass, you know, ensemble being competitive, or marching bands being competitive, and kind of.
But there was a period of time where that brass band, and you're right, we were a brass band society, probably from, I'm going to say, around the 1840s, 1850s, especially during the Civil War, and then after. But then woodwind started to sneak in. Matter of fact, in researching Pryor, his father, Sam Pryor, takes flack in the 1870s, early 1880s, because he's added a piccolo to the band.
Yeah.
All right. But I think what really pushed us away from being a brass band society was Pat Gilmore
Yeah.
and putting together his basically concept of a wind band and having it be a competition basically to a symphony orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
And I think once that started, you started to see more and more concert bands progress. And then Sousa came and, all the rest. And that just blossomed where we got away from just an all brass and band. And then the school band movement started in the 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And the drum and bugle corps basically grew up in, I believe it was around World War I. Drum and bugle corps started to evolve. I believe some of them evolved out of the fifer and drum corps of the 1880s, 1890s.
Yeah.
So
and other ones were similar to the British tradition where companies were creating brass bands to kind of keep their workers out of trouble at night. They were kind of doing that here with some drum corps with like Boy Scout troops and certain things trying to create kind of a recreational ensemble.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But then we went to become a concert band society more than a brass band. But now we're coming back. There's a lot more brass bands. I remember 29 years ago, in the state of New Jersey, there might have been 3 brass bands.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's quite a lot more just in the whole area. I mean, they've really, the movement has been taking off.
Yeah. I know Steven plays in a British-style brass band here in Virginia, and I think at least I find it interesting that we have that, resurgence of the British-style brass band tradition, exactly what you just said, the growing interest in that style, and it helps with, like, Kevin Stees at Madison and Georgia and, some of the collegiate ones happening, but then brass band of Battle Creek, it's kind of popularizing it with the strengthening position of NABA, being able to promote brass bands. But then at the same time, my doctoral research has identified about 65 current early American brass bands existing kind of parallel to that too. So while there's this growing or resurgence or whatever we want to call it of British style brass bands in the US, there is still that pocket of the early tradition existing at the same time.
Absolutely. Pryor's father put together a Pryor's cornet band.
Right.
I mean, that was in the 1870s.
Mm-hmm.
Matter of fact, even before that, about the same time, he put together Pryor's ladies cornet brass band. That was all his wife played. Matter of fact, a little known fact is Pryor was influenced by his mother playing the valve trombone.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
Yeah.
Did she previously play something before that? Do you know? Or?
We don't know, but there is. He makes a comment in one article I found saying that he was influenced by his mother playing the trombone, and I take that to mean because the valve trombone was being used in that earlier time.
Yeah, for sure. And
it would have been because his father put together this all ladies brass band.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't even play that. You got to realize back in the 1890s, women weren't even playing that. They were more piano. And for whatever reason, and then some women took up brass instruments, and it just wasn't accepted. You couldn't get, in a regular organization. But there were female players. Edna White, the great trumpet player, she was very active, recorded in the early days, played solos with Pryor's and Sousa's band, but was never an active member. Again, you got to look at the day, you got to look at the time and what things happened. Sousa's on the road. It's very hard for him to have a mixed group, and it wasn't accepted at that time. It's accepted now.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciate it, and we're looking forward to having you on again. Where can people go to find out more, about the research you've done, your collecting, and your store? Where's a good place to point people to for that?
The big thing is the store website is dillonmusic.com. All right. You normally can get a hold of me if you have questions or anything, steve@dillonmusic.com. I do have the Fife Museum online, but, if you need me, you can get directly a hold of me. I mean, I'm more than happy to answer questions or anything, like with anything on that, for anything historical. I always have been like that, helping people out with this. Although it's gotten a lot easier because there's a lot more research that has been done.
Right.
And there's a lot more out there with the internet.
Yeah,
definitely. Great. Well, we can't thank you enough again, Steve Dillon, for coming onto the show. We are excited for our future discussions, and we hope you have a safe weekend and a nice holiday season.
You do the same. Thank you so much.
All
Have
right,
a great day.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
You too.
you
Take
too.
care.
Bye.
Thank you again so much to Steve Dillon for coming onto the Early American Brass Band podcast. It's really cool getting to hear some of those stories about some of the early brass musicians of the 20th and late 19th century. And we unfortunately had to cut the interview a little bit short for the sake of time, but really awesome thing about that is that we already have planned future conversations and discussions that we're going to be having with Steve Dillon. So look forward to seeing Steve on the show again in the future.
Yeah, we can't wait to have him back on. There's a lot more we can go into with a lot of things. I'm sure you got the sense during the episode. So we're very excited to have him back on in the future. As always, there are show notes for this episode up on our website. That's eabbpodcast.com, along with a bunch of resources up there. And if you want to get in touch with us, follow us on social media, and you can send us an email at eabb.podcast@gmail.com. We love hearing from you guys, so feel free to reach out with any questions, suggestions, anything like that. It's always great to hear from listeners.
This episode's featured album is the album that Steve mentioned in the episode that was the duet between Arthur Pryor and Joseph Alessi. Released in 2011, Slide Partners is 100 Years of American Trombone Virtuosity. It's really unique, very cool album to hear these two legends from different generations playing at the same time. So we hope that you go on over to our show notes and find links to where you can purchase and listen to the album. Again, that's Slide Partners by Arthur Pryor and Joseph Alessi. Thank you again for tuning into the Early American Brass Band podcast. We will look forward to sharing more stories with you in the future and look forward for you to tune in to our future episodes. Take care.
Bye-bye.